From the College by the Lake, Coeur d'Alene, Idaho. Local, regional, national, and international guests discussing the issues and topics affecting the way you live are on Forum, the North Idaho College Public Forum, with your host and moderator, political scientist Tony Stewart.
Welcome to the second week of a 6-week series entitled Our Dissolving Privacy, Who's Minding Your Business? For you who were with us last week, you know that our guest was Bill Press, and he did an overview of the whole field of privacy. Now we're going to look at specific areas within that very, very important issue. And I welcome to our program a very distinguished guest who certainly has all the credentials to discuss this particular topic. And in the area that we've asked our guests to address, it is high tech and the right to privacy, particularly computers and how they are used in addressing this question. Our guest is an attorney, a journalist, an author, and a publisher. Robert Ellis Smith is probably best known as the owner and publisher of what is called the Privacy Journal. In addition to that, he has published a number of books and articles and is certainly classified as an expert on the subject of privacy. In the past, his books have included How to Protect What's Left of It. A second book is called Work Rights. And in January of 1993, a third book was published entitled The Law of Privacy in a Nutshell. And in the near future, another book will come out entitled Our Vanishing Privacy. Our guest is a graduate of Harvard and also the Georgetown Law Center. Mr. Smith, welcome to the program. It's a pleasure to have you back, as you were here with us in 1979, and we're very happy that you've been with us during this symposium on privacy.
Thank you.
And as always, I'm very happy to welcome to the program our regular panelists. First of all is Janelle Burke, who's an attorney in the state of Idaho, and next to her is Steve Schenck, who is the Dean of College Relations and Development at North Idaho College, and I shall ask Janelle to commence our questioning.
Let's jump right into the high-tech argument and talk some about the most recent developments in high technology. Over the past few years, there has been a lot of development, and some instruments that were not previously affordable are now much more accessible to the public. What 3 or 4 of those instruments do you think have had the greatest effect on our privacy?
Well, I think caller ID is one. That's the technology that allows the display of the phone number of the incoming caller. And originally I thought that the privacy argument clearly came down in the case of the recipient of the call. Then I thought that the privacy arguments were kind of balanced, and now I firmly believe that it's a dangerous and invasive practice that when you think in terms of the caller. This is a technology that now can be ordered for a monthly fee, which will send the phone number of the caller along to your line, and then we'll display it so that theoretically you can choose whether to pick up the line or not. But the main threats to privacy, I think, have come from computers, miniaturization in the last 15 years, the linkage of different computer systems, the telecommunications with computers so that they can talk even across national borders now and by satellites. And I guess the third area would be videotaping. It's no surprise to people that amateurs can now videotape a good deal. They are sometimes filming their neighbors and what they do and trying to catch their employees or their employers in illegal activity or embarrassing activity. And once again, we've seen miniaturization where videotaping cameras are so small they can be covert.
Actually, at one time, most of us probably thought in terms of privacy and government. The government perhaps getting into our private lives. But is it now is there such a profit motive involved that people are having privacy, their privacy is being invaded because of private companies? And
I think that's true. I spend
motives.
probably 80% of my investigative activities in the private sector. Credit bureaus, insurance companies, employers, hospitals, banks, credit card companies, a mailing list business. Big Brother really is twins in a way. I mean, it's an equal threat. I don't think right now in the 1990s you could necessarily say government or the commercial sector pose the greater threat. One interesting aspect about this is that there are exchanges of information across those sectors, and what is public and what's private really has become blurred in this area.
Steve Schenck.
Bob, just as a casual observer, it seems to me that some invasions of privacy are more annoying than anything else. I'm thinking about the callers at dinner time who want to sell something. But others can have a tremendous impact on people's lives. And you mentioned credit a minute ago. I have seen briefly some television news commentary on some of the really awful things that have happened to people as a result of errors in credit ratings. Have you had any experience with that,
Sure.
that type of problem?
More and more credit reports are used to make employment decisions when you apply for employment, and so it can cost you a job. And more we're seeing people assume the identity of a law-abiding citizen and perpetrate credit card fraud in that way by using their credit card numbers and their social security numbers to charge products and services without their authorization. Well, that's going to have one effect. It's going to give you a terrible credit report because you're not going to pay those bills. And even though you're not responsible for the balance that's run up by law, you still are left with a negative credit report, and the credit bureaus have not figured out a good way to take care of those victims of credit card fraud. And so you really burn twice, and it can take up to 3 or 4 years to get that credit report straightened out.
You mentioned something that's interesting to me. If someone steals my credit card number and uses it illegally, I'm not responsible for those bills.
That's right.
I have been told that if somebody steals my phone card number and uses that illegally, I am responsible for those bills. Is that correct?
I'm not sure. I don't know.
Is someone recently...
I think that would make sense because I know that the credit card immunity is a matter of law. It was passed as, I think the Truth in Lending law provides that immunity from responsibility.
What should people do to protect their credit rating?
Look at it. They should demand to see it. Only 3 major credit bureaus in the whole United States now, and you should not only demand to see it and demand to correct it, but have the correction sent to any entities that received the faulty information, and demand, too, to have the correct information sent to the other 2 major national credit bureaus. You should give up less information. Be very streamlined in filling out a credit application. You don't have to provide every bit of information. I don't think the Social Security number is necessary. I think people ought to keep that very close to their vest and not provide that. Those are the main things you can do.
Do you have any advice at all for someone who's been a victim of credit card fraud and is worried about their credit rating as a result of that?
Yes, call the big 3 credit bureaus and insist on talking to the official who's been designated as sort of an ombudsman to take care of these problems. And I would suggest reviewing the Fair Credit Reporting Act so that you know what your rights are with regard to correction of your records. And then in addition to that, get a letter from law enforcement indicating that you have been a victim of this crime. And keep it in your wallet.
Some of our viewers are going to wonder, I know immediately, what are those 3 large credit companies that they would need to inquire about their credit? Would you identify those?
Well, I'm fascinated with these. Originally, there were several all over the country, and then it became 5. Now there are only 3. There's a very ominous concentration in this business. One is TRW, which is mainly known as a defense contractor, but they own the most sophisticated credit bureau in terms of technology. Then there's Equifax, which has been in this business for most of the century, based in Atlanta. Their credit bureau is quite often known as CBI, Credit Bureau Incorporated. And then there's TransUnion, which is the smallest of the big 3, located in Chicago.
Mm-hmm. There's something else that has been really revealing today. We've heard over the years a lot of publicity about federal legislation and state legislation to protect privacy, and of course the most celebrated of those has been the Privacy Act that was passed by the Congress, which now has been a number of years ago. Would you take a moment for our viewers to first talk at the federal level and indicate what kind of legislative protections are in place, and also from what you have said today, I read into that it's not nearly as extensive in protection as the average American would think so.
That's the message I think I'd like to leave. You heard the questions from the audience today. Somebody leaked my bank records. Isn't that against the law? And my answer was not necessarily. In many states, that is not a violation of law. Somebody else said, well, it seems fundamental that I'd have a right to see my own patient record. There is no such law by federal law nor state law. There are about a dozen states that have such laws. Those are well, in addition to that, employment records I mentioned, that you don't even have the basic right by law to see your personnel file. So those are the 3 major gaps that I mentioned. I think banking, personnel, and the other area where you don't have these rights of access. Now, where you do have pretty strong protections are in the credit reporting field and in the insurance investigating field. In videotape rentals, ironically, strong federal law protecting your privacy there. In cable television records, That has to be protected. As you pointed out, federal government records, strongly protected. You have a right of some limited rights of access and correction with regard to arrest records about yourself if there was no guilty verdict. School records, that's an important area. It did not come up today, but colleges like this one are bound by a law that gives students rights of access to see records about themselves and limits what colleges can disclose about them.
In relation to that, as you've written in this area, and certainly you have a book in which you look at all 50 states, would you give us some idea of the 50 states, the states that would have the strongest protection of privacy and those that would have the least?
California has a very strong tradition of privacy, a Supreme Court that not only says their state constitutional protection of privacy is strong, but extends to the private sector, which is pretty extraordinary. The state of Montana has one of the stronger constitutional protections for privacy, and there have been a couple of courts that said that too extends to private entities. California has the strongest statutes that are on the books. Florida, Massachusetts, New York, Illinois, the more populous states, I guess, probably to nobody's surprise. The states which have the largest bureaucracies and the largest collection of personal information have pretty good record statutes.
And those that would have some of the weakest or lack of laws?
Well, Idaho, unfortunately, is in that category. For instance, no protections of state records and no right of access to your state records. No real statute protecting bank records, personnel records, medical records, insurance records. These are all key areas, and they're really exposed in the state of Idaho.
Good. Janelle Burke.
One of the things that has happened more recently is that you have records and you perhaps give your information to one company and then it's sold to another company and so forth. Could you sort of detail for our viewers how that happens, how that dissemination of information becomes much wider than the person who gave the information might have anticipated?
Right. It happens with two new entities, not new entities, but entities, important ones. And that's the mailing list businesses, which now don't simply take a list of addresses. They have to add dimensions to it, including census information that indicate a demographic profile of the people on the list. These are much more valuable to mailers. They're environmentally more responsible as well. You target the people you want to reach. You don't waste paper. But you also keep a lot of sensitive information about people. There's no law regulating it, so that information is pretty freely available in the in the marketplace. I don't think it's an area of great concern. It's an annoyance, as you pointed out. However, if you go back to basic privacy legal principles, in a way it's a ripoff. I mean, you are entitled to compensation for any use of your personal information without your consent. That's a basic principle. And the mailing list example is a violation of that, even though the compensation isn't all that great. And then the other area that I talked a lot about today is so-called information brokers. And these are mom and pop kind of credit bureaus. They'll give you a credit bureau for one shot. You don't have to subscribe for the whole year. And not only that, they have access to motor vehicle records, to Social Security records, workers' compensation records. It's one-stop shopping for the person who wants to intrude on your privacy. And even though the federal law requires that anybody getting one of these records has a legitimate purpose, I'm afraid that these information brokers will give it to anybody.
Now, the Social Security number that you have is a federal matter, but driver's licenses and motor vehicle licenses are state matters. Mm-hmm. Let's talk a little bit about driver's licenses and motor vehicle licenses and aspects of your life that another person can get into simply by having that information. Can you tell us what some of the dangers are there?
Well, the Social Security number is the key. With that, a person who wants to commit fraud can unlock the data system, can even pretend that he or she is you over the telephone and pose as you and get information. Not only that, it's a key to linkage among all these different systems. I was encouraged to hear that apparently the authorities in Idaho have backed off the requirement now that you provide a Social Security number when you get your driver's license. Many states put it on the face of the license, which I think is folly in view of what I said about how sensitive you ought to be about that. You don't want that exposed to the checkout person in the market or the person who cashes your check down the street. You want to keep that very, very close to you because it's the device for fraudulent activity. So there's no real need for motor vehicles departments to have the Social Security number, and it's encouraging that at least the one here has agreed with that.
What about drivers, the licenses that you have on your cars? What about those kinds of licenses? And are they used oftentimes for people who have ill intent somehow to find your home, burglars, that sort of thing as well?
They sure are. I mean, we all read about the Rebecca Schaefer case. She was the actress in the Son of Sam TV series, and some character who was stalking her back in Arizona got a private detective to get her address from the motor vehicle department, and he went over and killed her on her front doorstep. And there have been other cases. She's the most famous, but motor vehicle records are available to stalkers. Sometimes they have to pay a little bit, but California came up with a pretty good solution. You know, they said, we're not going to make this information confidential. Among other things, we make too much money selling it, but we will permit you to have what I call a buffer address. Give us a box number, give us an attorney's name, give us an agent, give us a landlord, and that's the address we'll release to the public. And I think that makes sense.
Steve Sheen.
Bob, in some of your other comments, you mentioned insurance investigation or investigating as an area of concern. That's one I'm not familiar with. What did you mean by that?
Well, these are commonly called consumer investigators. Equifax, which runs the credit bureau, also does most of this activity. When you apply for insurance, the insurance company will, for $10, $20, ask Equifax to do a report on you. And they will call up your neighbors, perhaps drop by, talk to your coworkers, find out if you have dangerous hobbies, if your drinking habits, smoking habits are extraordinary, whether you're a responsible driver, that sort of thing. Virtually all of it hearsay, virtually all of it I think unreliable. And then Equifax will provide that report to the insurance company.
And then that becomes a part of the permanent record about you.
That's right, it does.
Is there any requirement at all that insurance companies or others who engage in those sorts of investigatory practices notify you when you make application to buy their product? Do they have to tell you that this is going to happen?
They don't need your consent, but they have to notify you. And then if they reject you, and these reports are used in employment as well, if you get rejected, they have to tell you which which consumer investigating organization made the report on you, what their address is, and then you can exercise your rights under the law to see the file.
You know, you also mentioned fraud, and I have a tendency, I'm learning a lot in this privacy series, but I had a tendency to think about the loss of privacy more as almost a moral issue as opposed to a legal issue, something that I ought to be concerned about because, well, people just don't have a right to that information. But apparently there's a real criminal aspect to this. What are some of the other kinds of fraud that people engage in or can engage in once they have your Social Security number or other pertinent data?
Well, one of the reasons I stay in this issue and have not been burned out is because it does have so many guises. So far I've talked about kind of the civil law, but some invasions of privacy are crimes. Illegally wiretapping somebody, being a peeping Tom is a crime in many states, making harassing phone calls is a crime. So there are criminal aspects to it. And also posing as another or getting somebody else's credit report by false pretenses is a crime. And certainly using somebody else's identity or Social Security number is a crime. So there are very significant criminal aspects to this as well.
I would just add a footnote for Steve, and this is a question. We all are learning a lot this week, and I learned yesterday that there was an individual who his Social Security number was stolen by someone. He lived out west, and that was back east. And that person even became employed under that Social Security number, among other things, and was for a long period of time employed. And so it took him, I believe it's something like 2 years, to go through the governmental system to find out what he had paid Social Security on what this other person. I mean, without his knowledge it had happened, and it's a real legal entanglement, isn't it, Mr. Smith?
Yeah, it sure is. I'd like to add to Steve's point. I think essentially privacy is an ethical issue. I mean, what we're talking about are fair practices in business or in government. Treating people fairly, giving them a right of access and a right of correction seems to be fundamental principles. And I think that if you look to what's right and wrong ethically, you'll generally come up with the right answer with regard to privacy.
Bob, one of your outlines you had today, or you would have it added in the form of a slide, you had what I would call the hub or the center in relation to certain information. Then you had many organizations tying into that process. Would you try to visualize that for our viewers, how that works?
The credit bureau is really the switchboard of all of this. And so they would sit in the middle, gathering information not only from your credit applications, but every month by computer from department stores, major oil companies, travel and entertainment, credit card companies you do business with. And that information is updated monthly and then distributed to others who ask for a credit report. And regrettably, 2 of the major 3 credit bureaus are also engaged in the direct marketing business by extracting information from that and building these very, very targeted lists. And we've talked about these so-called information brokers who are tied into the credit bureaus. Credit bureaus do business with the federal government by law. There are lots of agencies in the federal government that make loans and make grants, and they want to check out people's credit. They also want to report delinquencies to the credit bureau, so there is an ongoing computerized exchange between those entities. Most of the entities we do business with will be tied into the credit bureau, and as I mentioned, more and more now employers are using credit bureaus to evaluate applicants. I'm not sure that it's that probative, that it's that helpful, but they use it nonetheless.
There was a very intriguing question that came up today, and I sense that you were also intrigued with that comment, that if certain agencies in the private sector are using information, taking your name information and selling and so forth, do you have any either ethical or legal right to claim royalties, at least that you could bill them? Would you share with our viewers what's happening in this field and if that's a possibility?
I think so. I was fascinated with that question, and I've toyed with the idea. The problem is that the amount of compensation you do may be minimal, but that's going to change as this intensifies. But essentially, it is a principle of privacy law that nobody can take information about you that's sensitive and use it commercially without your consent. In the consent process, you would probably negotiate some sort of fee. So some sort of compensation, I think, would take care of a lot of this. First of all, it would notify you that the information is being used. Secondly, I think it would put a premium on making sure the information is accurate. And thirdly, it would cut down on gratuitous uses of information. If the information industry had to pay people for the use of the information, they'd be much more discreet in the amount of information that they sold. And I would like to see somebody come along with the right lawsuit and say, that information about me is mine, it's my persona. You didn't get my consent to gather it, and every time you sell it, I want a percentage. And legally, I think it's a sound theory. Getting a judge to go along with it or getting the damages to be worth your while is another problem.
But if an awful lot of people did that, if it became a established practice, then with a lot of people doing it, then it could become expensive for those who are using the data. Exactly.
Well, it came up actually when a lot of credit grantors, like department stores, questioned the credit bureaus and said, wait a minute, you're making money off our information in your mailing list business. We want a royalty. It didn't go anywhere, but that concept has been established, and I think that the individual consumer now can insist on a royalty.
Janelle Berg.
I want to give you an opportunity to explain to our viewers some case studies that have actually happened, some examples of people whose privacy have been invaded. Perhaps those people didn't even realize that it was happening.
A lot of people don't. I mean, they don't know the extent of the problem, but I had a man call me 2 weeks ago, a very prominent lawyer in Washington, sophisticated, unlike most of us, knew the law and knew about an entity in Boston called the Medical Information Bureau. He had applied for life insurance about age 65. He was reevaluating his needs, got turned down. And he knew enough to call the MIB, which keeps medical information for life insurers. And he said, I'd like to see the information you sent over to the insurance company. He has that right. They called back and said, well, since you asked, we've discovered that there was an error in the file. It would not have been discovered otherwise. He had been treated for mild depression, and the MIB had listed it. They used codes, and their code translated into a major psychotic episode. It's a big difference, and you can see how that would affect insurability. Well, that hasn't been solved yet. He's still working it through to get that corrected. I had a man also in Washington who had his wallet stolen, and somebody else used his credit cards, and all this negative credit was developed because he wasn't paying those bills, and still battling with the credit bureaus to get that straightened out. And there was a woman in Massachusetts who wanted to deliver at home, and things went wrong. She was taken to the hospital in an emergency. The doctor, if you can believe this, before he treated her, berated her in the hospital and conveyed the story to his partner. His partner, never having talked to the patient, called the local newspaper and said what a terrible thing this was, and home delivery was outmoded and dangerous and all the rest. The newspaper ran a story about it. The child died. The woman, and this is the essence of privacy, suffered a real traumatic pain, and on the basis of that could collect in a court of law, which she did.
I don't want to take too much time because Steve is coming up here and it's going to be short, but I wanted to ask you about surveillance and wiretaps, both picture surveillance and also wires worn by someone so that they can pass along the information to, usually probably in that case it's government authorities, but it can also be used in divorces or in
Sure.
other kinds of lawsuits. Would you comment on surveillance and wiretaps?
Yeah, but, wiretapping throughout the United States is legal only if you have the consent of at least one party. And the fuzzy things happen, as you point out, in domestic relations problem, where an ex-husband may surveil a spouse, ex-spouse, and a lover or something of that sort. Well, is the ex-husband able to give his consent for the wife or whatever? Or in the house, when the head of the household wants to surveil his children. Those are the fuzzy areas, and the courts aren't too clear on that. But there is I think we should be realistic that wiretapping is not that prevalent in our society. It's damaging enough, but law enforcement has maybe 1,000, 1,500 a year throughout the whole United States. And in the private sector, maybe another 2,000. If you're not involved in domestic disputes, labor negotiations, or some sort of gambling narcotics trade, chances are you probably are not wiretapped and not surveilled. And I should say that it's very hard to detect, too. So you would have a real difficulty detecting it if you were. But I think we're seeing more and more video surveillance now. First of all, the insurance trade does it. Somebody files a claim, they'll send a spook in a car to take a picture to see if the person is lifting heavy loads, that sort of thing. And I'm getting a lot of calls now from lawyers who say employees are taking tiny little cameras to work and catching their supervisors in sexual harassment, discrimination, harassment of whistleblowing, or just plain illegal activity. And we've seen surveillance like that by the supervisors for a long time, but now it seems that the employees are getting in on it too.
Steve Sheen.
Bob, it sounds to me, and this is my impression, that the best avenue for an individual to take is to protect themselves from having these problems, because your chances of getting real satisfaction from the credit bureaus, the major reporting companies, et cetera, it sounds like it can be a frustrating, drawn-out, expensive experience. Do you have any last words of advice to people about what steps they should take to safeguard their privacy, their credit card numbers, their phone card numbers, et cetera?
Well, I think you're right. The essence of privacy is individuality anyway, and I think we have to expect that we will protect it, not the government and not organizations. But you can not fill out every single line and every single form that's put in front of you, and that goes with your children, for your children as well. You can always question authority. You say, why do you need the information? Keep your Social Security number as confidential as you can. Demand to see information about yourself. Demand to correct it if necessary. Even attach conditions to information. Say, to your hospital, I'll provide this information, but I expect that you won't pass it on further, and you can create a binding contract with them.
With that, I have to bring our program to conclusion. Robert Ellis Smith, on behalf of the panel and our staff, thank you very much for this very informative program and all the time you've spent with our community. Ladies and gentlemen, I know you've found this program extremely informative, and Mr. Smith is an expert and is also on privacy and the publisher of the Privacy Journal. I invite you to be with us next week at this same time, when we will do program number 3 in the 6-week series on our dissolving privacy. Until then, please have a good week. I am Tony Stewart.
The North Idaho College Public Forum was videotaped live from the studios of Telemedia Services on the campus of North Idaho College for viewing at this more appropriate time. We invite you to join us again next week for another all-new edition of the North Idaho College Public Forum on this public television station.